This is Chuck Yarborough, Mississippi history teacher and recently featured on NPR's 50 Great Teachers series. You're listening to the New Teacher Podcast.
The New Teacher Podcast. Get inspired. If you're a new teacher interested in hearing about the latest tips and tricks to inspire you in the classroom, you've come to the right place. The New Teacher Podcast features interviews with award-winning classroom teachers, the latest authors, and educational leaders recognized for their proven teaching techniques and strategies. Hear the stories of their success and failure. To listen to past episodes, view show notes, or to contact us, please visit our website at newteacher.org. Now here's your host, Anthony Arno.
Welcome to the second episode of the New Teacher Podcast. We're glad that you can join us today. This is Anthony Arno, and we're here today at the NJEA Teachers Convention, booth number 1225. If you're a New Jersey educator, I invite you to stop by our table and see our upcoming show schedule and enter a drawing to win an iPad mini, which will be given away at the end of the show. If you're not here today, we have something for you too. I invite you to leave us a review on iTunes for a chance to win a signed copy of Julia Thompson's First Year Teacher's Survival Guidebook. Julia was our guest last week on episode 1, and if you did not hear me talk with her, you can catch that interview on our website at newteacher.org. We will be picking a random person from the list of iTunes reviewers on the last day of this month, November 2015. And now here's my talk with Chuck Yarborough. Today we have a very special guest, and he's a history teacher from Mississippi who was recently named one of the top 50 teachers from NPR's recent series. Chuck, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Anthony. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you can join us today. Let's go back a little bit. Do you have a personal story about a teacher that inspired you as a student, and what do you remember the most about that teacher?
Well, I went to a Catholic middle and high school run by the Brothers of the Sacred Heart. And generally I remember being inspired by the consistency and care that the brothers showed for myself and my classmates. But in particular, Brother Bennett Bishop, who taught me English my senior year of high school, he inspired myself and, generations of young men from Mississippi and Louisiana to remember that to whom much is given, much is expected. And that was a lesson that really took with me. Brother Bennett was the founder of the drug-free powerlifting movement in the United States, and I just remember a man who really cared. He knew his content, but he really cared, and that was really inspirational to me.
And he was your high school English teacher, but what directed you into a career as a social studies history teacher?
Well, I was just kind of a humanities guy, and actually in high school and even my freshman year at Vanderbilt, I was a physics guy, I was Mr. Science. But I was drawn to that which did not come easily to me. And Brother Bennett helped me to understand that maybe English literature wasn't going to come easily to me, if you know what I mean.
Right.
It was not the class I got the best grades in, that's for sure.
Have you remained in contact with Brother Bennett?
He has passed away. I did remain in contact with him for a while. And he, actually, there are, national awards named in his honor in the Powerlifting Association. I'm not a powerlifter, but he was somebody who made an impact far beyond the classroom.
Wow. So tell us about the moment that you decided you wanted to become a teacher.
Well, I don't know that there is really one moment. However, I was drawn to teaching from an early age. And to be frank, that was a fact that I had kind of forgotten until about a decade ago when I ran into one of my old friends. And he asked me what I'd been up to because I hadn't seen him in some time. And I replied that I was teaching history at the Mississippi School for Mathematics and Science in Columbus. And his immediate response without, any thought at all was, "Oh, you always wanted to be a teacher." And, and so I guess the answer is really that I guess I knew I wanted to become a teacher before I really knew that I wanted to become a teacher. So
right.
It's not really one moment.
So you're known for Tales from the Crypt. To our listeners, Tales from the Crypt is a year-long research investigation that celebrates the local history, and it attracts over 2,000 attendees during the student presentations. Tell us about this annual tradition in Columbus, Mississippi that takes place at the local cemetery.
Sure. Tales from the Crypt was the brainchild of one of my late colleague and mentor, Mr. Carl Butler. And it's a year-long research, writing, and performance project that takes place in several sections of my junior U.S. history courses. The story is the students are introduced to local history, and then they select the name of somebody who died before 1930 who is buried in our local Friendship Cemetery and who has not been researched previously. For the fall semester, the students conduct research at the local history archives. We use Ancestry Classroom, Heritage Quest, a lot of resources at local universities or area universities, and they construct a primary document research paper that I'm proud to say is really a college undergraduate level work. From that, they produce an original script that comes out of their research, and every student auditions in competition with the others. This year there are 67 students in the project, so there will be 67 auditions in January. And then the best 9 or 10 will be selected. They'll develop their characters further, and every other student becomes part of a production team. So, if you were selected as a performer, you would have 3 or 4 other students, and the 4 or 5 of you together would be responsible for a final performance that would take place by candlelight on the gravesite of the person you researched. You would be responsible for the costumes, for the blocking, for the final script, for any interaction with the audience that you would want to develop. And the ultimate goal is it's not a genealogy project, it's a history project. The kids are trying to illuminate some aspect of our collective past using a local person as kind of the entree to that, the example.
Wow, that sounds so interesting. But
it's a pretty cool project.
When Mr. Butler started this project, what was the initial reaction like from the community? Today you have over 2,000 people showing up for this presentation, but what was it like in the early days?
Yeah, well, in the early days, from my conversations with Mr. Butler, they initially developed the program in order to have a research project in one of his history classes. And he felt like a presentation format was, all the literature suggests that gifted kids really respond well to some kind of public presentation of their work. So he came up with this idea, and he expected, as he told me, maybe 60 or 70 people to come. And the first night they had an audience of 300.
Wow.
Now, that's a big crowd. I was in a couple of high school productions, and I'm probably not exaggerating to say that the only people that came were our parents and grandparents and godparents and brothers and sisters who were forced to be there.
Right.
But we have incredible community support, and really, I think what has happened is that this project has revealed, not just to this community, but to other communities throughout the state and region, and maybe the nation, that young people, when asked to do something for the community, can deliver. I don't even present it as a history research project. I present it as a community service, that you're going to explore some element of the past that will help this community understand itself better in the present, and that will empower us to make a brighter future for ourselves. And the kids respond.
That's great. Now, for our listeners, we will have a link on the show notes. There is some video out there of your students presenting, and it's quite remarkable. It really is.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So Tales from the Crypt has been an annual activity at your school for the past 25 years, and the students never research anyone who was previously researched by former students. Who are some of the more interesting people that have been researched by your students that have been laid to rest at the Friendship Cemetery?
Well, of course, I'm asked that question frequently. And my typical answer is I always try to pick my brain and say, well, there must be somebody really interesting that I should think of. But I don't know that there's any one or small group of particularly interesting people that have been researched. All of the research subjects have had interesting stories that could be told. So it's not really the people researched that have been particularly interesting, but rather the stories that my students have chosen to tell from, the middle of their research. For example, there was a young lady about 10 years ago whose name was Erin Williams, and Erin was from Meridian. And Erin's research subject was a woman. Last name was Gay, and she started to do the research. And what she discovered was that her research subject had been married in the 1850s and had had a child who died before the age of 2, and then had another child who died before reaching the age of 2, had a third and then a fourth child, all of whom died before the age of 2.
Wow.
I mean, and really what her research paper became was an exploration in medical practices and infant mortality in the mid-19th century. So, again, it not really a genealogy project or a biography project, but a history project on one element that she got to through her, through the story of that person.
Wow, what an exciting research.
It was great. But what was really powerful about that, and this, I think, highlights my point about story, Erin's performance, when she auditioned and was selected as one of our performers. And the year that she performed, an audience would walk up to the grave plot, and she would be laying out flowers and kind of in an embittered tone would say, "What do you want? Go away. Well, if you're going to stay here, I'll tell you my story." And she relates how, as a young lady, she had fallen in love and gotten married and looked forward to the birth of their first child, and her husband was excited, and the child was born, and shortly thereafter died. And then it happens again, and after it happens a second time, you could see, I was fascinated by this, so I would go watch the performance whenever I could. The audience would start to look at each other, as if, what's she doing wrong? And then a third child dies, and by that point, the members of the audience were really, almost leaning into each other and saying, nudging, almost chuckling, wow, what's wrong with this woman? And then a fourth child dies. And when the fourth child died, Erin would pause, straighten herself, and stare at the audience and say, of course, each time a child dies, the mother falls under suspicion. And at that moment, every member of the audience, each time I watched, would go ramrod straight, separate from each other, and they would stand there guilty as charged. It was so powerful, and when performance works, it does what Erin was able to do in that audience. She challenged people to rethink what they thought they knew about the past, and when you empower people to do that about the past, you're really empowering them to think more rationally and maybe even critically about the present.
Absolutely.
And, it was. I mean, it was just a great performance, and that's one of my all-time favorites. There are others like that.
I'm sure.
Like I said, it's not so much the individual that was so interesting, but rather what the students do with the research they uncover.
Well, how do you pick the graves?
It's far from scientific. I have, I look at interesting names.
Yeah.
For example, that particular name, the research subject name was Pluvium Gay. And I selected the name because I never knew anybody named Pluvium. I just thought, well, I know more about that person.
Okay.
This year there's somebody on the list whose first name is Argyle. I just find that interesting. Some of them will be suggested. We've been doing this long enough that people in the community will say, oh, well, there's a really interesting story about this person or that person. And this year, in fact, I became aware of the Chronicling America project, and Mississippi newspapers are now available. So I actually went back and looked at some of the old newspapers from before 1922 and just kind of quickly, skimmed them looking for names, and then I cross-referenced that with the burial records in the cemetery. The students often think I know everything about everybody in the cemetery, but I don't.
Right.
like I said, it's one year I walked through the cemetery and I just looked at the big tombstones and said, well, we haven't done that one before. Let's do that one. So
that's incredible. Do you ever have a year where they're visiting the library and the public records and they just can't find anything? Well,
that has happened. And my list, at the beginning of the year, I generate a list of about 110 names. So if that happens, I do reassign them or allow them to be reassigned. But that is happening more rarely now because of the access to digital records. We just have a wider amount of information that's available to students. So they're able to find something. And then, that, like I said, it becomes the entree. Sometimes they don't find information or much information about the research subject, but they'll find information about the people that surrounded them, husbands, fathers, brothers, wives, cousins, business partners. And that's a story to tell as well. So we stick with them in that case.
Right. Is there anything else you're doing, Chuck, that's as exciting as Tales from the Crypt?
Well, I'm excited. I think that this type of project where you take the local and you help students connect with the national or international is a recipe for magic. So I like to try and develop projects like that. In my African American history class, we do something called the 8th of May Emancipation Celebration. The 8th of May is the day that Union troops arrived here in Columbus in 1865, and it was celebrated for over a century as the local Emancipation Day. You know, kind of nationally, the local version of the national Juneteenth celebration. So we take that as a performance date, and students in my African American history class research African American leaders from the late 19th and early 20th century that are buried in one of the historic African American cemeteries, the Sandfield Cemetery. And we'll bring those stories to life in conjunction and in partnership with a student-directed gospel choir called Voices in Harmony. And this year, some of my students have created, and I've helped to moderate, a new group we're calling the Race, Ethnicity, and History Club, or REC. Right. And then we also have partnered with local schools. We're trying to make this broader than just our school, but some of the other schools in the community. And we've had singers from those schools join us this past year. So it's a similar project, except we do perform in the cemetery, yes. But rather than touring from gravesite to gravesite, we kind of set it up as a stage show almost, and the choir will sing, a performer will step forward and reenact somebody's life, and then step back, and then more song, and we finish asking the audience to rise and sing with us, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is often referred to as the African American National Anthem.
Right. So let's talk to the new teachers. What is one thing that a new teacher can do tomorrow in their classroom to become more effective as a teacher, Chuck?
I would tell them to tell lame jokes. I think that...
I'm sorry, say that again?
Tell lame jokes.
Oh, I thought you said that.
Yeah, lame jokes. For example, one of my favorite, first day of class, almost always say, remember, folks, don't fall in love with a tennis player. To them, love means nothing. And it's the deadpan, terribly corny joke that, you're letting your guard down, you're being honest with a student. And I think that's the first step toward creating community in your classroom. And ultimately, and that's the other thing I would say, is create community in your classroom. If you treat your classroom as a place where people belong and you think in terms of it being a place they want to belong, then you're moving down the right path to success, I think.
Right, absolutely. The creation of community. If one of your students failed an assignment or a test or a project, how would you respond?
Well, I've never had that happen. No, I'm joking. I think as a young teacher, first you have to try and analyze where the errors took place and what the nature of those errors are and the causes of those. And then I'm going to meet with the student. I think one of the mistakes that many educators, both new and longtime educators, make is that they forget sometimes that we have to be about individual students. So I'm going to meet with that student and try and come up with a plan to help them get back on track. A failed assignment, from my perspective, is just another teaching opportunity. Right. It may be the most important teaching opportunity that you'll have. It's going to be teaching a student not only how to learn, but how to turn moments of failure into consistent success with hard work and with attention.
Absolutely. Whether it be a failure by the student or the teacher. So, Chuck, tell me of one time when perhaps you made a big mistake, and how did that help you become a better teacher? I can't think of one. Not one.
Well, I know I've made mistakes, and it may be that maybe that's a key to success is leaving them behind, learning from them, but then trying to correct. I do think that, and I know I have to consistently and regularly pay attention to guard myself against projecting poor negative expectations on a student. Sometimes a student will make an unfavorable impression upon you for whatever reason. And it can be fairly easy to project that expectation on them. If you think negatively of a student, you could project negative expectations on that student, and then they won't succeed. That's kind of human, right? I mean,
human
sometimes
nature.
students
Yes.
offend us. They're not the nicest people. I mean, sometimes we're not the nicest people.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
I think that when I have had instances I've not been proud of, it's when I felt like I wasn't doing a very good job of preventing myself from projecting negatively on a student.
Right. Now, you've been selected by NPR for a recent series as one of the top 50 teachers. Tell us a little bit about that and how you found out about that, and how has that changed your teaching career, if any?
Well, I mean, first of all, it happened in part because one of our former Tales from the Crypt students happened to be interning at National Public Radio. And I think a conversation came up, and he said, I think they were, as I understand it, they were discussing projects that were pretty cool. And this young man who had been a Tales performer said, we did this really cool project in high school. And as he began to talk about it, people at NPR were interested, so they called me up and talked for a while about what the project was and what we had done with it, and we've gotten some other recognition. We were national finalists for the History Channel's Save Our History Classroom Award. We won the Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts, and we've won a lot of other regional awards. So, it just kind of naturally happened. As far as changing what I do, it hadn't changed at all the way I approach what I do. But I do think it has been kind of an extra inspiration for the students. The students who did the project last year were the ones that were featured in the broadcast, which was on Memorial Day this year.
Right.
And my current students are well aware of the national attention, both with NPR, and we've gotten some attention from the Atlantic, and we've been in the Anchorage, Alaska Daily News a few years ago.
Wow.
That's
right. There was a piece in the Atlantic, and we'll have that on our show notes.
Uh-huh.
You're listening to the New Teacher Podcast, and our guest today is Chuck Yarborough, and he is a teacher down in Mississippi. Chuck, what is one book you could recommend to our new teacher listeners that would help them become a better teacher?
Well, I'm kind of a fan of the inspired teacher kind of stories, and I've thought about one that I loved and still reread occasionally is Pat Conroy's The Water is Wide, which is semi-autobiographical fictional treatment of his teaching on one of the sea islands of the southeastern coast. But I don't know that there's one. I love Teacher Man, for example. I kind of like that type of story. I think sometimes some people say we need to be doing more best practices kind of reading, and I don't disagree with that. But I think there's a nice place for inspirational things, stories that uplift us with possibility.
Right. And Chuck, what is one internet resource that can really help a new teacher in the classroom?
Well, for history and social studies teachers, I think teachinghistory.org is a great resource. It's a project that offers lesson plans, links to valuable resources, tips that are related to best practices. There's an Ask a Master Teacher feature as well as an Ask a Historian feature. And it links you to some wonderful resources like the Library of Congress, which would be another great one for history teachers.
Right. So what's the best thing about being a classroom teacher?
It's the magic. I jokingly say to my students, welcome to the Hogwarts School for Witchcraft and Wizardry Mississippi campus. And I think, to me, on a daily basis as a classroom teacher, I get to be an essential part of young people that are growing into real leaders in our communities. And I think that's magic, and that can happen in every classroom, in every school, and it can happen every day if the classroom teacher creates the environment to make that happen.
Absolutely.
So, that's the best thing to me.
Cool beans. Do you have an educational quote that you can share with us to inspire our new teachers?
I don't know if it'll be inspirational, but it's been helpful to me to remember. And it's one, I don't recall who originally said this, but my good friend and also mentor, Dixie Butler, who's a longtime kind of legendary elementary school principal here in Columbus, Mississippi, she used to say, the ones who come are the right ones, and what they need is what it takes. And I don't know that there's a better job description of what we are supposed to be doing than that.
Right. Okay, Chuck, are you ready for the final minute before the bell?
Sure.
Okay, morning person or night owl?
I'm both.
Mac or PC?
PC.
Favorite book from your childhood?
Johnny Tremaine.
First paying job?
I was a yard man, in quotes, at the age of 13, earned the princely sum of $35 a week for yard care.
One television show that you try to watch every week?
There isn't one, although I'm a huge college football junkie, and I will watch a Law and Order rerun any place, anytime.
Last music download or song played on your iPod?
The older I get, the better I was, by Big Joe Shelton, who's a local bluesman in Mississippi.
One famous person that you would invite for dinner, either living or dead?
This one is tough. I would love to have dinner with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Now, you're down in Mississippi, but let's suppose it's an unexpected snow day. What are you going to do with this unexpected day off from school?
Well, first of all, I am in Mississippi, and I've had exactly 3 snow days in my career. Okay.
And how many years have you been teaching?
This is my 21st year in the classroom.
Wow. So what did you do with those unexpected snow days?
Well, I'll tell you, we had 2 this past year. So on the snow days, I make a Mississippi sled with my son. And a Mississippi sled is when you remove all the hardware from a wheelbarrow and you turn it into a sled. And then we go to the hill of the local highway bypass, which is clear and therefore covered with, we're going to at most get maybe 2 inches of snow. And we go sledding down the hill on the side of the highway.
Now, is that safe? Do you have to wear a crash helmet or something?
Well, no, and I'm sure it's not safe, but we don't wear crash helmets.
And the next item on your bucket list?
Well, is to go to San Francisco with my wife. She has never been.
And there's the final bell. Chuck, how can our listeners get in touch with you?
Well, my email address is cYarboroughG@themsms.org. And I'd love to help anybody who feels like I can help them.
Well, thank you so much. You've been listening to the New Teacher Podcast, and our guest today was Chuck Yarborough, a high school history teacher from Mississippi. Chuck, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to talk with us today.
Thank you, Anthony. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you. And there you have it, my talk with Chuck Yarborough. He sounds like such an amazing teacher. Thanks again, Chuck. Our guest next week is high school Latin teacher Steve Perkins, the 2014 Indiana State Teacher of the Year. Steve will talk about his passion for a language that some believe is dead, but he does everything to keep it alive in his students, including singing classic rock songs in Latin. In addition, Steve is also a fellow at the Failure Institute. Yes, the Failure Institute, which he will talk about in my conversation with him. Well, that's our second show. Thank you again for listening. This is the New Teacher Podcast, and I'm your host, Anthony Arno. Be well.